From the magnificent Midwest, it's the Suzanne Venker Show, where men and women are equal in value, but wildly different by nature. Join us here every week when we challenge the culture's hugely flawed narratives about men, women, sex, and love. From coast to coast and from around the world, thank you for joining us. So most of us are aware that what happens to us in childhood has a huge effect on who we become as adults. But what if the opposite is also true? What if what doesn't happen in childhood has an equal or even greater effect? The absence of emotional support in childhood is as damaging as other traumas. Childhood emotional neglect is not a form of child abuse because it's subtle and usually unintentional. Rather than a direct act, it's the absence of action. It's essentially inaction. The result when a parent is disengaged in this way is that a child learns to ignore and hide his feelings from others, even from himself. Children in these homes learn very early in life that emotions are troublesome and inconvenient, and they take this mindset with them into their adult lives. In contrast, children whose emotional needs are treated as important are encouraged to pay attention to their emotions and are either taught or modeled how to manage and express them. But children who experience emotional neglect are essentially taught that their feelings don't matter. A child who receives this message isn't consciously aware of it because it's not stated outright. It's a subliminal message delivered by the absence of a response from a parent. But the result is that the child suppresses his emotions by pushing them away so he doesn't bother his parents or even himself with his own emotions. And years later, the same individual will continue to lack access to his emotions, which will almost certainly wreak havoc in his life. Here to discuss what I believe is a prolific problem today is author and psychoanalyst Erica Komisar, who, if you've been following this show for a while, you will know that I have had her on several times because she is the go-to person on anything having to do with childhood trauma, in my opinion. Welcome back to the show, Erica.
Suzanne, thank you for having me.
It's so great to see you. You're always my go-to. Anybody who's been listening to this show for a while will know I think this is your third visit in a year and a half. Maybe it's coming up on 2 years this summer. I can't even keep it straight. But so glad to talk to you. You're the first person I want to talk to anytime I'm dealing with anything child related. So thanks. Awesome. So this is going to be kind of heavy stuff today. Just want to tell everybody this is not an easy subject at all, but I truly, truly believe that anybody watching can relate. And I think these issues are not talked about and they're prolific. I do think that. You have more of a gauge as a therapist in seeing this than I do, so you can kind of confirm that or not. But that's what I see on my end. So I'm really excited to dig into this. So I want to start by talking about what some signs of childhood emotional neglect, which I think you call attachment disorders, look like, or what I'm going to go through some things and you can tell me yay or nay. This is the research that I did on it that felt very familiar. I'm going to go through these lists first. Let me just read it and then we'll go back to the beginning. Feelings of emptiness, meaning I don't know who I am, looking for yourself, so to speak. Fear of being dependent on anyone or feeling like you're going to be rejected or let down if you trust someone. So difficulties with trust. Difficulty with self-compassion, but a lot of compassion for others. Guilt and shame, not wanting to be a burden on other people or thinking that their feelings are shameful. Self-blame, feeling like you don't succeed or you're always going to get something wrong rather than being really confident about your knowledge or your ability. Difficulty nurturing yourself and others. Poor self-discipline and a poor understanding of emotions. And that gets into I think we should probably first start by saying what childhood emotional neglect is so that people can get their head around it. Or if you want to describe it differently, that's fine too. But let's talk first about what it is. Those were the signs. Let's talk about what it is.
Well, how I would think about it is that children who experience what we call attachment disorders, or you could also think of it as not deeply connecting with their primary caretaker. If it's their mother, primarily it's mothers, but it can also be fathers. But whoever is primarily responsible for the emotional well-being of that child in the beginning is called a primary attachment figure, right? So again, most of the time mothers, but not always today, but that person, if they're not emotionally and physically present enough for that child in the first 3 years, we end up with what are called attachment disorders. And there are a number of different attachment disorders that are correlated with different forms of mental illness later on. So what we know is from looking at longitudinal attachment research, meaning research in the attachment field that's been going on for over 20 years, where they looked at very young children, the age of about 1, and then they followed those same children. By the way, not an easy thing to do.
Yeah.
Follow children
Yeah.
for 20 years. It doesn't always work out, but the ones that you can follow, followed them for 20 years. And what they found is that the children who suffered from attachment disorders at 1 still suffered from them at 21. And what do they look like? So if I may just go through a few different kinds of attachment disorders, because what you described, when you just described different kinds of results from emotional neglect in children, are the results of different kinds of attachment disorders, meaning we're all different, right? We all have different reactions to stressful situations, right? I might get headaches, you might get stomach aches, someone else might get backaches. We tend to have different reactions based on who we are as individuals, but also who our mothers are or who our primary attachment figure. So the first one I'd like to talk about is secure attachment. That's the ideal. The ideal is that your mother is, I'm going to use the word mother, but what I mean by mother is primary attachment figure. That if your mother is emotionally and physically present enough in those first 3 years, you develop what's called emotional security. And what that essentially means is that after about 3 years of having your mother there on a consistent and constant basis as your go-to person when you're in distress. So it's the person you go to when you need soothing and when you need to come back to what we call emotional homeostasis, right? We all want to be, there's always fluctuation of emotion, but we all want to be kind of in a harmonious state emotionally. We call that emotional homeostasis. And to bring us back to that state of satisfaction, if you will, we need someone in the first 3 years from moment to moment to guide us, to soothe us when we're in distress, to soothe us when we're overly excited. Basically, whenever our emotions are dysregulated or too up or too down, we need someone to bring us back to center. And if we have someone there present enough in the first 3 years, we develop what's called emotional security. We internalize that person after about 3 years, and then we can summon that person up whenever we're alone and we can't find someone, a real person, to soothe us in distress. We can summon that person up. We call it an internal mother. You can summon that person up and that internal mother soothes you. So you don't always need someone there to soothe you because now you've internalized that soothing presence. Okay, that's secure attachment. And that leads to a healthy, emotionally healthy person who can have healthy emotional relationships, can commit to relationships, can depend on others in a healthy way, what we call interdependence, because we don't really want to go for independence. That's not what we're going for as human beings, even though that's the way we talk about it in our culture. We don't want to be independent. We want to be interdependent, meaning we want to be able to fluidly go between leaning on others in our environment who we love when we need them and when we're in distress. And if they're not there at that moment, then we can fluidly turn to ourselves and lean on ourselves in that moment until someone is there. So we say that ability to go back and forth between leaning on others and leaning on ourselves when we need soothing is a sign of emotional security, that kind of fluidity. So let's talk about if you didn't get that presence, what happens? The first type of emotional sort of repercussions and the first type of attachment disorder is called an avoidant attachment disorder. This is when the mother leaves the baby and comes back and the baby turns away from the mother when the mother returns home. So you come home from work, whatever, and your babysitter or whoever's taking care of the baby, or you go to daycare and somebody hands you the baby won't look at you. The baby seems not to care that you're there. The baby has disconnected. And mind you, it's a strategy. It's a defensive strategy. It's a protective strategy. Babies use that strategy to cope with the loss of their mothers. Now, by loss of their mothers, that might be a mother who's physically absent. It could be a mother who's physically present and emotionally absent. Yeah.
No, go ahead. I just want to go through what that might look like for people. Go ahead.
It could be physical absence. It could be emotional absence. And what does that look like? That could be a mother who's depressed.
Mm-hmm.
It could be a mother who's distracted,
mm-hmm.
who's overwhelmed, who is, could also be a mother who is resentful and so has disconnected herself. You know, sometimes as mothers get overwhelmed, they disconnect. But that produces this reaction in the baby, and I'll give the baby words. The baby says, right, my mommy isn't there when I need her, so I'm just gonna have to take care of myself. Okay.
There you go, bingo.
So that's what the baby does, and the baby develops a strategy, and that's a strategy. We call it an avoidant attachment disorder. Now, what happens to that baby 20 years on? That strategy is the same strategy they use as adults and throughout their childhood, but as adults, when they meet other adults who they would be quote unquote intimate with. They have trouble connecting. They have trouble trusting that connection. If they can connect, it's not for very long. And their go-to is, I must depend on myself because no one else is dependable. As John Bowlby, the father of attachment, said, you know, your healthy attachment is the scaffolding by which a child develops their view of relationships for the rest of their lives. Okay. So now you have this avoidant attachment disorder where this adult has trouble connecting with, depending upon, being intimate with, and committing to another adult. Or later on, if they have children, to their children, because we say it's generationally passed down. You want to ask questions about that one, and then I can go on and talk about
Sure. Well, I want to ask too, just to clarify from what I said in the opening. So is this another way of describing childhood emotional neglect? How does that, they're just two sides of the same coin then, correct?
Emotional neglect is a layperson's term to describe, you know, the basis on which a child will form that kind of detached, defensive way of dealing with. So again, neglect is a word that basically, I mean, the mother may be very well-meaning.
Mm-hmm.
She may be a mother who's ill.
Mm-hmm.
It may be physical illness. You know, we're suffering from COVID now. There's a lot of mothers who are suffering from long haul syndrome
mm-hmm.
and can't get out of bed. And so it's not always, there's not necessarily malice in it.
Yeah, right.
Neglect can come in many forms.
Right. I have a cousin who calls it benign neglect. I don't think of it as benign, but I understand what she's trying to say. You know, she just means it didn't mean to.
Some may be benign. I mean, unintentionally, if a mother suffers from depression or mental illness herself,
Mm-hmm.
you know, if the family is going through a terrible stress, marital conflict or divorce. Poverty and impoverished situations, you know, those mothers are not tuned into a baby's emotions or a baby's thoughts, or, you know, they're very occupied with whatever is going on inside of them or whatever's going on in their environment.
I have a list here of the different types. So when people are listening, they're thinking about their own upbringings, this might help make it a little bit easier. I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different descriptions of the kind of parent, which we basically have touched upon. The divorced or widowed or depressed parent. So the parent who's so absorbed in their own problems that they can't meet the needs of someone else if you're meeting your own needs like that. Then there's the addicted parent. So an alcoholic parent, right? They can't adequately take care of their child. There's also the workaholic parent, which I think we could use as distracted. You mentioned the word distracted before. So if you're a workaholic type and that's really what you do, you're distracted. You're not able to really tune in. There's the narcissistic parent, which I think is often overlooked. Basically, the mom who's or dad who's usually mom, I think, more concerned with themselves than with the kids, you know, how things look, how, you know, basically more concerned with herself or how the kids make you look than the actual needs of the kids. And then the achievement / perfection focused parent. So that would be, I would assume, really big recently with this, we're consumed with our kids having, the best of everything and going to the best schools and getting the best grades and what kind of career are they going to have, and all this outwardly, all this focus on outward achievement rather than the person themselves. So those are the different types that
narcissism. And I would say that all of those things you mentioned are the results of that attachment disorder. So you'd say a narcissistic personality disorder is the result of childhood neglect. So if you say, it's like, where does the chicken and the egg kind
it's
of...
all learned, you mean?
Yeah. Well, no, a narcissist, well, it is learned, but a narcissistic personality disorder is the result of having been neglected. Children who are neglected by their parents, it may be the unintended consequences of that neglect, right? As you say, you can have a mentally ill mother. You can have a mother who's impoverished and just, is fighting to survive and can't be there. You can have a narcissistic mother who was neglected 2 generations ago. We call this stuff generational expression. Narcissistic personality disorders are passed on from one generation to the next because neglect is passed on one generation to the next. So we say that 90% of a person's mental health is environmental. Only 10% is constitutional. So if you see that then and say, right, I had a narcissistic mother and I'm going to break that cycle in my generation and go into therapy because I don't want to pass on to my children what my mother was passed on by her mother, if that makes sense.
It makes of course it does. It makes a lot of sense. In fact, I wonder I always wonder what percentage of people end up going that route versus just continuing what they learned. I think that's really fascinating. And I don't know that there's a way to pinpoint or know what percentage goes one way versus another. Or another thing that my husband and I are always talking about, he's particularly fascinated by people who are able to do that versus the ones that are just stuck. Like it's fascinating. I don't know any material that I've really ever delved into that studied that particular difference of the ones who do and the ones who don't.
Well, it has to do with whether you feel symptomatic or not. I mean, basically someone who has a as therapists, we say narcissistic personality disorders are the hardest to treat because the defenses are so rock solid. But whether the person seeks treatment or not depends greatly, and whether they're reachable depends greatly on whether they feel any pain. Because often, again, the defenses around that particular illness protect the person from feeling any pain.
Mm-hmm.
So the only way we ever go into treatment is if we feel pain. So what brings up pain? Adversity can bring up pain. Things like losing a loved one, divorce, death, physical illness, some of the things that we talk about being terrible things for adolescents today, because I have a book coming out about raising resilient adolescents. One of the things that we talk about is how sometimes these mental disorders, if discovered and treated early, are ways for that adolescent to break out of that cycle of whatever that family is passing down. So for instance, if you're a teenager and you have an eating disorder, or you struggle with alcohol addiction or drug addiction or OCD or ADHD, and you get proper treatment, problem is most kids are not getting proper treatment. There's an opportunity there in that adversity to break that cycle because you're getting to that person when they're in pain. The problem is, as you and your husband were saying, people that never feel pain don't seek treatment.
Gosh, how do you not know you're in pain? That seems strange.
Oh my goodness. Yeah. You can have a narcissistic personality disordered patient who doesn't see any of it as their problem. It's
yes, I do know that. Yeah.
So it's never what I'm doing or,
right.
Always somebody else's problem.
Yeah. Right. But isn't that specific to narcissism or no? With
it is
deflecting it or whatever.
But all of the addictions that you mentioned, alcoholism, drug addiction, and what I said, eating disorders, any addictions, they are what we call narcissistic disorders of the self. So they are results of of a narcissistic disorder. So eating disorders, alcohol, drug, they're all the result of narcissistic disorders. So all of this, just to say, all of this goes back to neglect.
Okay. Yeah. So I want to get back
to neglect.
Yeah. Neglect. So we talk so much and so openly, I think, in our culture about actual neglect, physical neglect, if you don't have proper food or housing or whatever the case may be. But emotional neglect is just never addressed, which is one of the reasons that makes you unique, I think, because it's so prolific, I think, and it's so personal that it's almost like opening a can of worms, right? I mean, when you think about having been neglected emotionally, first of all, nobody likes to talk ill of their parents. So there's that piece of it, right? And I shouldn't say nobody. A lot of people don't. Some people love to point the fingers, but some people don't want to do that. And then, of course, the people who inflicted that damage, whether it was intentional or not, do not want to take that on. That's very difficult. But at the end of the day, the result is that these children are essentially walling off their emotions and their feelings, and so that they're inaccessible as a result of this experience. And then they're going through life continuously in pain to where it's manifesting itself in negative ways in their relationships, which is what I want to talk about. One of the things that I read that children who did not get their needs met emotionally struggle with is anger and assertiveness. These two things in particular, that no one sort of modeled, because no one modeled how to deal with getting what they want or having their needs met. They kind of, they're flailing about in the wind, not knowing how to get them met, right, in an appropriate way.
Yeah, well, I want to talk about the other two attachment disorders, because now you're getting into a different territory. So
Okay.
Remember I said that avoidant attachment disorders are connected to feeling detached later, which basically is connected to depression. Mm-hmm. So we say you see a connection, a correlate between avoidant attachment disorders and the inability to form relationships later on and feel connected to those around you, and depression. So we see depression is connected to avoidant attachment disorders. That's the long-term risk, you'd say. Ambivalent attachment disorders, that's when the mother comes home and the baby is so intensely anxious and clingy to the mother, clings to the mother, can't be soothed in distress, is absolutely fractious and can't be soothed. And then clings to the mother all the time, follows the mother around and can't let the mother go. And that's a different strategy. So, right now, how would that baby sound? That baby would sound like this. My mother left me. She could leave me again. She only pays attention to me just in very short spurts. I better cling to her so I can make sure she doesn't leave me again. Right? Or so maybe she'll pay attention to me if I pull on her leg. And so we call that an ambivalent attachment disorder. That's most closely related to severe anxiety later on. And the last one, which is probably the most difficult of the three, and the most challenging of the three, and probably connected to the most serious mental illness and connected to what we call borderline personality disorders later on, is a disorganized attachment disorder. What does that look like? The mother comes home and the baby has no strategy, right? Remember, the avoidant baby had a strategy: turn away, be independent, deal with things on my own. The ambivalent baby said, I'm going to cling to my mother and never let her go because she could leave again, right? The disorganized attachment baby has no strategy. And so what they end up doing is cycling through all the strategies with no stop, right? First they'll cling, then they'll turn away, and then they'll smack their mother because they're so enraged. And then they'll feel badly that they smacked her and then cling to her again, and then turn away and be detached and then slap her again. So it's cycling through all of the strategies, but having no one strategy. And those babies end up with more likely borderline personalities, and angry, very angry, emotionally erratic, paranoid, in what we call in the paranoid persecuted position, people that are very sort of hypersensitive, almost paranoid in relationships and situations. We all know people like that, right? Mm-hmm. That's connected to a disorganized attachment disorder. So when you say anger, in general, the people who come out of the avoidant attachment disorders don't tend to be angry. It's more the disorganized attachment disorders that are angry. That makes sense.
Well, yeah. So the disorganized ones are more associated with that much more serious type of mental illness, you're saying, borderline and whatnot, right? So what about all the people who had the emotional neglect but would not fall into that category? Wouldn't you say there's A, more of them, and B, is it harder to delineate that group from the others?
Think of mental illness on a spectrum. You can have a borderline personality disorder, but you can also have characteristics of a borderline personality. You can have narcissistic characteristics without having a narcissistic personality disorder. So people hear these words and they think, ooh, it's one thing.
Yeah.
Not one thing. You can have signs of depression without being clinically depressed.
Right.
So know that mental illness is on a spectrum, from mild to more severe. On the milder end, that disorganized attachment might lead to a very angry adult who's very angry at their mother, very angry at relationships, but might have personality characteristics that are similar to a borderline personality, but are not a full-blown personality disorder. That's the best way I can describe it. And it's why that as psychoanalysts, we, here I am telling you about these diagnoses. We don't diagnose people. We think of them in terms of where they lay on the spectrum in our minds, but we don't diagnose them. We just say, right, this is someone who may have suffered in this way based on their personality. They may have suffered more from having an avoidant mother who is detached. You say those workaholic mothers. We would say that they're more detached mothers, right? Anyone who flip the switch and go to work and not think about their baby all day and then come back and flip the switch back on, you have to do what we call a schizoid flip. You have to shut the light switch off and turn it back on.
Well, and the end result for the child can be the same. Like maybe there's people who can turn off like that and they're colder, let's say, but then there's ones who are not necessarily cold, but like you say, they're detached for different reasons. If they're depressed, if they're absorbed with their own relationship with the divorce, or if they're, have a love relationship with alcohol and that's what they live for. I mean, whatever it is that's taking them away, does it matter at the end of the day? I guess that's the question. Like, does it matter
what kind of attachment disorder?
No. Does it matter what kind of what the cause of the distraction is to the child?
No.
Whether it's like distracted is distracted, right?
Yeah. Although I will say, it's interesting. I will say, when I wrote my first book, I put a caveat in there, which is that babies know when their mothers desperately want to be with them, when the mother's minds are on them.
True.
So you have a very poor mother, like she's socioeconomically disadvantaged mother, and there's a lot of those in this country, more than ever before, now because of COVID. And those mothers are desperate, both in their mind and in their hearts, to be with those babies. They don't leave those babies willingly, and they feel a deep sense of mourning when they have to leave those babies. And those babies feel that. They feel it. And those mothers mourn with the babies. They're sad in the morning when they have to leave. And they're sad when they return because of all that they've missed. And they almost kind of take responsibility for what the absence. Yeah. And then there's mothers who really just say,
check out.
I can't wait to get away from this baby. Babies are not for me. I can play with the baby on weekends, but somebody else has to take this baby.
So what's the takeaway of the difference between those two? Because I know exactly what you're talking about. I think I even wrote that myself in one of my books, that a kid knows whether or not you want to be away from them or not. Mm-hmm. If you are distracted all the time for A, B, C, D reason, not just work, but you do want to be with them and be better or do better for the child, what's the difference in the outcome for the child that's got that situation versus one who's doesn't care as much, if that's for lack of a better word?
Well,
or is there any difference at the end of the day?
Mourn with the baby. You express sadness, and the baby expresses sadness, and you let the baby express sadness, and you reflect the baby's sadness, and you allow the baby to be sad about it, or to be angry about it if the baby's angry about it. Whatever the baby's feeling, the mother allows for that and actually takes responsibility for it, both in words, and facial expressions and reflection and action. It's a whole different demeanor that the mother who really, so, mothers ask me all the time, what do I do with my guilt? And I say, your guilt is a great tool to help mourn with your baby. If you feel badly that you haven't been with your baby, don't shut that guilt off. Use it to help you to mourn with that baby. Take responsibility for being away. Apologize and say that you love that baby, and you feel so responsible for being away from that baby. And that, both in action and in facial expression, that reflection of and allowing that baby to feel sad. I mean, mothers who come home and want the baby to be happy that they're home, without letting the baby be sad, actually contribute to the problem.
Yeah. Can we talk a little bit about between like ages 5 and 18 and not just babies as far as this goes? How does the emotional...
Well, so that's a good question.
Yeah.
The idea is that what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas, I guess is the expression. What happens in early childhood stays with us throughout childhood and adolescence and into adulthood, unless we get treatment which disrupts it. So what's the disruptor? The disruptor is therapy. If you don't get, and medication is not a disruptor. Medication is a symptom reliever, but it's not a disruptor. So if you want to disrupt that, that defensive pattern from childhood that is causing great pain and will continue to express itself throughout childhood and adolescence and adulthood, you have to disrupt it, right? So there's books written by colleagues of mine on how psychotherapy actually changes brain chemicals and helps to sort of re-stimulate the parts of the right brain or the social emotional brain that have been damaged by things like neglect. So,
yeah, I've talked a lot about, it's shocking to me the number of children who will grow up with this missing piece in their upbringing and never saw a soul about it. Never got help, never got therapy, never literally took all that stuff that was happening to them and just, it's all inside them. It's just, they're internalizing it, and it's never, you don't talk necessarily to your friends about it. You might, but in order to really get at it, like you're saying, you need help, you need outside help. And there's kids, I shouldn't just call them kids, all the way up through 18, who just literally never get help. And then they're just carrying it with them throughout their life, and they have no idea that it wasn't normal. You can't go through all that and just go on with your life like nothing happened. You have to get help. Yeah. If you, like you said, I like the word disrupt. That's a great word, to disrupt that process, right? Yeah. Or that pattern.
Yeah. And also, therapeutically, it's really important to understand where that pain comes from. So, today we just want someone to give us a pill, literally, and make the pain go away, or do a little cognitive behavioral therapy, and it's a quick fix and the symptoms go away. But the truth is, unless we understand the origins of our pain, we can't really get to the root of the pain. It always is with us in one form or another. And so when you go into therapy, anywhere in that process, whether you're a child or an adolescent or an adult, what you're doing is you're having to really grapple with the cause of the pain, and which is those earliest relationships and what they are doing to us, what they have done to us. But it's also then accepting on a certain level the issues that our mothers have. So to understand that our mothers aren't demons for the most part, maybe with rare exception, but that the mothers that cause this kind of pain, the mothers that neglect their children, have been neglected themselves. The mothers that are anxious, have raised anxious children, are anxious themselves. Mm-hmm. The mothers who are, and nobody talks about this, Suzanne, and I think it's so important in today's generation in particular, or I would say the last 2 or 3 generations, is ambivalence about children. We don't talk about ambivalence because we're not supposed to, right? People aren't supposed to say they hate having children. But the truth is that there are many, many people walking around, mothers included, who really feel very ambivalent about caring for children. They love children. Yes, they love their children. If you ask them, they would say, of course I love my children. but they resent their children, and they resent the dependency, and they resent caring for their children. So that hatred, which is side by side with love, takes the form of distance. There's a distance between a child and a parent, whether it's because that child is the object of that parent's aggression or anger. As you said, when parents are very angry all the time at their children, it's usually a sign of, mixed feelings, ambivalence about their children. And remember I said there's something really crazy making about a disorganized attachment disorder, because remember, those babies that don't have a defensive strategy and cycle around, those mothers have those same strategy, the same lack of strategy. So those mothers are sweet, sweet, sweet with the baby 1 minute, and then completely distracted the next, and then really angry the next. So it's passed down generation to generation. But that ambivalence, so how do I say this? There are more people with symptoms, borderline symptoms in society today.
I wanted to ask you.
Than I have ever seen before. And that means that doesn't mean they walk around with borderline personality disorders, all of them, but they suffer from borderline symptoms because their mothers had a love-hate relationship with mothering. And therefore, they have now developed a love-hate relationship with mothering.
I'm sorry to say that in my coaching business, I've run into that more than I ever thought I was going to. I mean, I shouldn't say I ran into it. I came up against what I thought was that it's not for me to diagnose, but when I feel it or see those same patterns, I move them along to get clinical help because I'm not their person. But I'm surprised at how many I've seen just in the 2 years I've been doing it, honestly. So I was going to ask you that, is that because you've been doing it for years? So I've had people ask, why is this so prevalent today and where it wasn't 30 years ago? I mean, there's an obvious answer, I think, in my mind, but go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, so, the word neglect is a funny word, because what is the difference between abuse and neglect? They're in the same vein, really. In some ways, neglect is more powerful than abuse. But, I mean, you could say a child who's got a mother who is angry much of the time, and then switches between giving them a hug and telling them that they love them a lot, and then losing their temper all the time, and then checking out when they're not losing their temper, or squeezing them and hugging them and feeling guilty and telling them they love them. There's a lot of that now that I'm seeing. And again, it doesn't make those mothers bad people. It makes those mothers products of those environments. So it's important that whenever I talk about mothering and mothers and babies and people's mental health as adults, you have to look at the whole picture. That's what therapy does. It gets you to look at the origins of things, and then not just your own origins, but where the origins of your mother's neglectful behaviors came from.
Yeah, for sure.
You understand it in a bigger context. Yeah.
And just to sort of close it out or make it easy for people to understand about really what we're talking about is childhood feelings, emotions, feelings, not the physicality of whether you're changed or getting fed or what have you. And at the end of the day, what I've learned about this particular problem is that those feelings, I think we touched upon this before, they get squelched or walled off, and they don't go away. They just sit in there.
Yeah.
Right? When that's happening. And then those old feelings can be triggered throughout. I want to talk for a few minutes about adulthood. When you get past that, I don't know whether let's say you haven't gone any therapy whatsoever, or maybe even if you have, but you're taking that with you as an adult, so that the slightest thing can trigger, I hate to use that word because it's so overused today. I hate overused words, but trigger whatever you experienced growing up, and you have this automatic response to it. So what are some of those, and what happens in marriages and relationships in particular that can cause that person who was not emotionally cared for properly to be set off, let's say?
The triggers can be anything painful, right? So it could be, if you're talking triggers, any adversity can trigger.
Stress.
Yeah, any
Stressful
form of stress
situation.
or adversity, right? So that could be losing a job, that could be breast cancer. That could be, you know, any kind of physical illness. It could be a parent dying. So, you know, as I say, it's terrible to lose a parent who you love deeply and feel at peace with, and who was very loving and giving to you. But it may be even harder to lose a parent who you felt ambivalent about growing up because they abused or neglected you, because you're left with all of those angry feelings towards them, right? So it could be the death of a parent. You know, it could be, you know, sort of any disruption in your life, that would cause pain.
And does it cause the ability to relate to your spouse or your significant other? Or is that a separate thing?
I mean, what we would call it is a breakdown. We still call it a mental breakdown. You know, that's, it's not like the kind of breakdown that necessarily puts you into an asylum like in Victorian times, but you'd say it's very common for people to have breakdowns at certain points in their life. And the way that I think about it is that mental breakdowns are opportunities. They're not necessarily the worst thing in the world. I don't know if you've ever gone skiing and you are trying desperately not to fall down. And when you desperately try not to fall, you break your neck. Whereas if you let yourself fall, you get up and you get your balance again. So sometimes these breakdowns are very, very good opportunities to work on yourself, really, and your relationships. Yeah.
Awesome. Okay, so you have a book coming out. I want to talk a little bit about that because I loved your first one and I can't wait for the next one. So, and it's so timely. I love the subtitle. It's Chicken Little, The Sky is Falling. And then the subtitle is Raising Resilient Adolescents in the New Age of Anxiety. So tell us about that.
So, well, the book is really about how the sky isn't falling. It's actually Chicken Little, the sky isn't falling. Because I think we all feel like the sky is falling. And I think the point is the sky doesn't have to fall. I mean, children are susceptible to their environment in two critical windows of development. One is 0 to 3, which was my first book. And the second critical window of brain development, and what we call development of emotional regulation in human beings, is 9 to 25, or adolescence. And we know that in that period, they're very susceptible to their environment, and we're their environment. Parents are their environment. So we talk a big game about the big environment, and they're susceptible to that too, you know, political instability and global warming and racial issues. I mean, that's all part of their environment, but we are really their environment. So the point of this book is to help parents to identify when their children are under stress, to prevent it if possible, and to deal with it when it occurs. And so it really goes through, I would say it's a very comprehensive. I was having trouble recommending to parents that I was working with a comprehensive guide to mental health of adolescents. And so I wanted to write something that would be very useful for many years to come in terms of being a comprehensive guide for parents to know, first and foremost, how to prevent mental illness. Secondly, how to identify it. And thirdly, what do you do if you do identify it? So that's what it's about, basically. And it's heavy on prevention.
Oh, so into prevention. The earlier, the better. I truly believe that's the answer to almost everything. Just get it in early, everything. I have a question for you. I don't know if this is going to come out right. I'm just thinking of it now. Is there a space for people who have these dysfunctional, for lack of a better word, upbringings, where they don't get a mental illness per se, but they still struggle in various ways through their work, through their relationships, for other reasons, but they're not really mentally ill?
I wish we could widen the scope of what that means.
Yeah.
Let's take it off.
I think that's a hard word for people. That's why I'm asking, they think of it as.
Let's take it off of a mental illness and say people can have emotional challenges that are on the low end of the spectrum of mental illness, meaning we still have things like mild anxiety, mild depression. There's even a diagnostic code for these things, as opposed to debilitating anxiety and debilitating depression. But, from my perspective, it's all on a spectrum, right? So if we say that, and there's a diagnostic kind of criterion, and if your emotions and your behaviors related to your emotions are getting in the way of your relationships, of being able to work, of being able to hold down a job, is getting in the way of things like enjoying your life. Those are all diagnostic criterion for the emotional challenges that mean you need help. Right?
That makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because I can hear people listening to this and going, gosh, don't we all have something? When we broaden it in that way, which I totally get, I would think, I think pretty much everybody has something on some scale, to deal with.
I mean, I've always said I've never met a neurotic person that, wasn't interesting. I mean, our neuroses makes us, and neuroses just means our conflicts make us more interesting people. If we were free of all conflicts, then we'd be pretty boring, actually. but having said that, it doesn't always escalate to the level of needing treatment, right? Yeah. So, there are plenty of people out there who, have blue days, have days when they feel very blue, or suffer from mild anxiety when they're in stressful situations. And they may not run to a therapist. They may not need a therapist. They may call their pastor. They may call their sister. They may call their brother. They may call their parents, their best friend. And it may do just fine for them. Mm-hmm. But
it's not really the existence of it really as much as what are you doing with it?
Yeah, well, and also, it's everything, as we say in my field, everything is intensity and degree, right? So like I said, everything's on a spectrum. Mm-hmm. How intensely we feel these symptoms, right? If we were neglected as a child, but we have really wonderful friends, a wonderful spouse, great children, a pastor that we love, or a minister or a rabbi that we love, and we have a strong community, doesn't mean those people will end up in therapy or need to end up in therapy. But it's when we really have gotten past a threshold where our immediate environment is no longer really helping us with those issues.
Okay, I want to ask you one last thing before I let you go about anxiety. Do you feel, from my perspective, from what I see, it's almost a word people love to use today, especially like the younger they are, the more like everybody has anxiety. And of course you can just connect it so much with what's happened in the last 20 years with social media. And I get it. I get the connection from a common sense standpoint, but is it of your opinion that people are misdiagnosing anxiety today or over-diagnosing it and calling it the wrong thing or no? Or is there, I think there is an uptick. We know that, right? But
good question. Everybody has fears. Fear is a primary emotion, like primary colors, red, yellow, blue. Fear is a primary emotion, and it's actually our oldest emotion. It sits in the part of the brain that is the oldest part of the brain. So fear is a normal human reaction to stressful situations. The difference between anxiety and fear is that it's normal to feel fear in the moment that we're confronted with a dangerous situation, right? If a car almost hits you and you're in the street, then you're going to feel fear in that moment. If that fear lingers with you, and every time you go to walk on the street, you imagine getting hit by another car, then we're talking anxiety. So my best definition for depression and anxiety, which I think kind of says it all, is depression is preoccupation with losses that we have from our past, right? Okay. Anxiety is preoccupation with losses in the future that may never happen.
Oh, I like that. That makes sense. I love plain talk.
Right. So
that's
if you
great.
Think of it
yeah.
Think of it that way, and you say, no, not everybody is around with anxiety. Some people just feel frightened of really scary situations. I mean, COVID.
My father was like that. He had terrible anxiety. There used to be discussion between my sister and me whether it was depression or anxiety. I'm like, no, it's anxiety. It's not depression. And the way you just said that was they are connected for sure.
I mean, you can have both. You can be preoccupied with past losses that make you preoccupied with future losses.
Sure. So I mean, who knows? That's always what I saw was him trying to keep things from happening, and very much focused on what could happen and just this horrible things that could happen in the future.
And the word that distinguishes fear from anxiety is preoccupation, right? When you think about it a lot, when it influences decisions that you make, when it influences major life decisions, so just to put it in plain talk, so then you never cross the street by yourself or ever because you're afraid of getting hit by a car. So then you can never leave your house.
Sure.
So, when our decisions are directed by that preoccupation, then yes, we say, Houston, there's a problem, then we're talking anxiety. So no, not everybody is walking around with anxiety, but a lot more people are walking around with depression and anxiety than ever before, which is why I write these books, because I try to get people to understand that the origins of depression and anxiety are, for the most part, the roots of those disorders are in early childhood. And if we don't understand that and are afraid to look at it, then we will never be able to stem the tide. We will always just be putting out fires our whole lives. And, medication is not the answer, because medication, with rare exception, medication can certainly help with our symptoms. But if that's all we're doing, is
just a Band-Aid.
Our symptoms, it's a Band-Aid it's aspirin for a brain tumor.
That's good.
Yeah.
That's good. Absolutely. It's like a temporary fix. It's not that different from just wanting to drink a lot for a few hours so you zone out or something, or take a drug, and then you just wake up and you're right back with your problem again.
That's right. It's immediate gratification. And we're big into that in our culture, which is really kind of sad, because the only way to really kind of change the way we feel about things in the future is to really look at the origins of things.
Absolutely. And you're right. We are so bad at that, especially when it has to do with the early years of a child's life. No question about that. That's why everybody needs to get all of your materials and your books. So tell me when your book is coming out, and tell everybody. October. Yep. Okay. And your site is just your website.
www.komisar, KOMISAR.com.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Erica, for coming on and explaining all that.
Me, Suzanne.
Love it. Hope to see you again soon, and can't wait for the book to come out.
Thank you. And thank you all for listening.
And that ends this hour of the Suzanne Venker Show. Don't forget to continue the conversation on Facebook by typing in the Facebook search bar, The Suzanne Venker Show. Also, please recommend this podcast to one friend you think would enjoy it. And don't forget to leave us a review on whatever platform you're now using. Finally, if you have a question or comment for me, you can email me at Suzanne@thesuzannevenkershow.com. Thanks for listening, everyone. Have a great week.